How can architecture be a facilitator and generator of a new culture of openness and inclusion, creating permeable enclaves as real social condensers and putting sustainable solutions into action? And so for us as a practice, it was about mediating this two scales, the mediating between the city of objects and the city of people, and how do you kind of try to negotiate that realm and create a wonderful city for people to do that.
As I invite on stage Biju Kuriakose.
Topic which is very close to our heart as a studio, the idea of density, and many of the challenges and the work that we do is to do with how to kind of negotiate density. So I'm going to quickly take you through some of the context within which we practice, and through some of our projects how we kind of deal with the idea of density. The socio-economic and political context that we live today throws many challenges at us which deeply impact the long-term sustainability of our cities. In times of pervasive digitalization, migration, climate crisis, and increasing social divisions and inequitability, the creation of places to meet the other has become one of the most crucial tasks for us as architects, particularly in the Indian context where the increasing population densities are rendering land as a very scarce resource. New configurations of public spaces and buildings are required to facilitate intergenerational dialogue between different people, genders, and cultures, while also addressing concerns of environment and equitability. How can architecture be a facilitator and generator of a new culture of openness and inclusion, creating permeable enclaves as real social condensers and putting sustainable solutions into action? To what extent can a building extend beyond the notion of an object by itself and address the issues of a fragmented social realm? India, as you know, is the world's most populous nation, with an urban population expected to grow from 410 million in 2014 to about 814 million by 2050. India houses around 18% of world's population in 2.5% of global land. The situation necessitates an acknowledgement of density as a permanent aspect of urban living. The Indian built landscape brings together complexities in the form of pervasive market-driven approach and the need for socially vibrant developments that can help create livable, sustainable cities. Looking into the future, how will India address the needs of a growing population to house the next million urbanites? What are our roles as architects in shaping this built environment? So given that we have about 18% of world's population needs that needs to be dealt with in 2.5% of global land, density becomes a crucial part of our thinking when we practice. So can buildings be representative of one idea? Can we choose to ignore the many complexities that come with the practice we do, and without engaging with these various complexities and contradictions that comes with the context that we practice in, can our cities and buildings be truly sustainable? So what is the context in which we practice? And I think it's very important to understand what is our context, because many of our work is driven by this understanding of what that context is. This is, for example, Chennai as a city. It has a land area about 426 square meters with about 11 million people, and have an open space ratio of about 0.81 square meters per person. And if you compare that with what WHO proposes, one needs about 9 square meters per person to kind of create a livable city, and we are at about 0.81 square meters per person. And if you look across the country, you will find in many cities similar kind of conditions, other than probably Delhi and Bangalore, which traditionally had large swaths of open space. Most of the cities kind of struggle to kind of create these kind of open space. The other statistics is the fact that about 50% of urban India goes to work by foot and non-motorized transport, which makes us extremely sustainable the way the cities are right now. And if you look at our development regulations, we are actually looking at organizing density in the most insensitive way, with the idea of creating not a sustainable walkable city, but the idea of creating fragmented, non-sustainable city. If you look at the traditional figure ground, the density is often organized around the periphery, while if you look at modern cities, the way we build, looking at our building regulations, we leave a setback and put the density and the least part of our site. And this becomes an extremely challenging proposition for us when we start to practice in a context like this. And hence we continue to create cities which are dominated by cars and not by people. And I think Robert talked about in the beginning, and a lot of what we do is a result of the kind of building regulations we have. On the top is your traditional development parcel where you have buildings coming in the periphery and a courtyard in the middle. While if you look at the bottom is how we build our cities today, which is we leave the setbacks taken over by cars and create an object along the city. And the cities, our cities then becomes a collection of objects without any relationship to the city itself. It becomes a collection of real estate plots. And so for us as a practice, it was about mediating this two scales, the mediating between the city of objects and the city of people, and how do you kind of try to negotiate that realm and create a wonderful city for people to do that. So these are a set of projects that we've finished within a university in Chennai, where we try to kind of continue to work on many of these aspects, looking at how to negotiate between these relationship between the built and the unbuilt, between the figure and the ground, and work around the existing building regulations to create places for people. And so this is a large campus, about 60-acre campus. We did multiple buildings within the university. This is the first building we did, which is the School of Aeronautics, where you can see in the section of the building that negotiation between the built and the unbuilt, and the idea of working with the existing building regulations to create places for people. And here is a campus which completely opens up. It's not an enclosed campus. It just opens up to, the building just opens up to receive the larger campus. It becomes a wonderful place to come together and celebrate the idea of coming together and academics, etc. And so the building is lifted up. You allow the ground to be very porous. You allow, and in a climate like Chennai, it becomes a wonderful place to congregate. And it just gets taken over by people. And in many ways, what Robert talked about in the beginning, how do you look at buildings as places as opposed to buildings as objects? And many of our explorations comes from that thinking, is that how do you create places for buildings for people? And so it just becomes, and when you start to build denser, because in this case it was a horizontal campus which became a vertical campus, and as you build more and more denser, how do you allow density to be lighter? And the idea of engaging with the other aspects which kind of evokes your other senses like light, air, rain, etc. How do you embrace them? How do you allow them to kind of be experienced in a larger, higher density development? This is the School of Architecture, which we just completed. Again, a very tight site within the larger campus. We started negotiating. We lifted up the building. We allowed the campus to come into the building. We started with an atrium in the middle. We realized it's not working because it was a very rectilinear site. And if you continue to create and develop the traditional way with an atrium, courtyard, etc., we realized it doesn't kind of create the kind of spaces that we need, especially in an architecture school. So we created something called a sectional courtyard. It allows a courtyard in each floor, which then opens up into the next, which then opens up into the next. So in other words, that courtyard is being created in the section, and in a climate, again, like in a climate like Chennai, it allows you to be in that space throughout the year, throughout the day. And it also allows us to create a new configuration of built and unbuilt, new configuration or new relationship between the figure and the ground, where the ground is actually within the figure in many sense. These are just some illustrations of how we kind of handle this. We lifted up the building. That space is then carved out from the building. It's not just the space is carved out. We then allowed that space to kind of move cantilever over. So one block cantilevers over the other one to protect the space to kind of from the southern sun, and so that space is always shaded through the day. And then the larger programs comes and kind of hugs it. These are diagrams of each of the floor plans. You can see each floor has a courtyard. The idea of creating identities for the people who occupy it and create a sense of place and allow people to kind of take over the building. And so the ground is again left open more as a exhibition space. And each courtyard each floor has a courtyard which then opens up, and then that becomes a language of the building as well. That's how the building looks now. You can see the density is much lighter. Even when you are on the 7th floor, you feel like you are on the ground floor because you're constantly connecting with the outside. And the building completely breathes all the time. And even when you are on the 7th floor, you look down and you are connecting with all the context. You are experiencing rain. You are allowing the air to pass through the building. And it creates a wonderful breathable density, and which allows people to come together and held together by that social space. That's that cantilevered portion. And then, of course, multiple spaces are created within that larger space. And so by the end of every semester, the juries, exhibitions, workshops, etc. happens in this space, and it becomes a wonderful place for people to come together. Again, a very open campus, very porous campus. It just allows the building to be largely like a thoroughfare in many sense. And these are some of the other buildings we are doing in the campus. And you can see that section becomes a crucial part of dealing with density and creating spaces for people and looking at buildings as a placemaking exercise. Our thinking in architecture parallels our thinking about cities. It becomes important to negotiate between the private realm of the building and its role in the street and the neighborhood as a means to strengthen the community and the local identities. Ideas of multiplicity in use, intensive typology mixes, and reconfigured spatial interdependencies needs to be pushed to new boundaries. We believe that the process of design must embrace and acknowledge all the complexities of the context and allow the building to truly become an extension of the city. Irrespective of the scale of the building and the nature of its ownership, the act of building collectively becomes the act of shaping our cities. And so housing is something that we've been dealing with for the past 7-8 years, and it's important to understand that in many sense, housing is one of the most difficult typologies we have to deal with, especially in our context. And housing is a precondition both for work and for leisure. More than any other item of consumption, housing structures the way that individuals interact with others, with communities, and with wider collectives. No other modern commodity is as important for organizing citizenship, work, identities, solidarities, and politics. Housing at many levels is under attack today. It is caught within a number of simultaneous social conflicts. There's a conflict between housing as lived social space and housing as an instrument for profit making. Conflict between housing as home and as real estate. So this is what we encounter every day especially when you start to kind of deal with housing as a typology. And so there are three types of housing crisis I often talk about. One is about the accessibility, which means that about 330 million households around the globe looking for housing, and which is a crisis which has been there for decades. Second is the crisis of funding, which is what we called as the 2008 housing crisis, which is in many ways an inflated housing crisis, which is not the real housing crisis. It is about lack of access to cash. But there is a third housing crisis, which is the crisis of citizenship, which we believe very strongly is within the realms of us as architects and designers to kind of deal with and negotiate with. And so this is something from Korea, who says that with urbanization, architects have a larger role to play in conceptualizing the new growth options. There is much more to housing than building houses. The room is only one element in the whole system of spaces which a family needs in order to live in a city. So he argues that about 22 square meters per person is required to be lived in a city, to have in a city to create a livable city. And he says that about 10 to 12 square meters of that you will find in the larger context in the form of schools, hospitals, etc. But the rest of that 10 to 12 square meters you need to find within a walking radius, which is your park, open space, social spaces that you needed. And if you look at our developments today, you don't really kind of create that kind of spaces. You hardly create 1% of 1 square meters per person in many of the developments that we do today. And a lot of it is owed to the way our building regulations are written. So for us, it was very important that if you deal with housing, we need to engage and create spaces for congregation, create spaces that inculcate values, a sense of belonging, and vibrant spaces. Otherwise, housing is not meaningful. It is the idea of home, the idea of building that community that is so crucial. This is a project which we're just completing in Trivandrum. It's in the heart of the city. A 1 acre plot. Kerala has one of the highest FSIs, about 4.5-5 FSI, when it capture all the development regulations. And so it became an extremely challenging proposition. When we went into the site was surrounded by these 12-story, 16-story buildings. And we knew that if we build up traditionally the way the ground up, it becomes an urban jungle. And so we started organizing the density from the top. We could go much taller than our neighbors. So we started organizing from the 22 stories down. And by the time we reached the third and the fourth floor, we got all the density that is allowed to be required to be built in that site. And the site was about 10 meters below the street. So what we have done is we kind of got all our densities up to the third and the fourth floor. And because the site was 10 meters below the street, we allowed all the parking to kind of come within that 10 meters. So what it does is that all the parking kind of comes within that 10 meters, which is a natural basement. And you created a new ground which kind of ties to that street. And the unit starts only at the third and the fourth floor. And so we end up creating that entire site as a park and becomes a community veranda for people to kind of come and enjoy it. And so that's kind of how we kind of looked at, and we kind of created multiple grounds as we created more. And each of these units were designed as if they are floating in that park. So they stop at different levels. It allows to create a new context for that lower units, while the upper units open up to the larger context of the city of Trivandrum. And in the process, you created a reverse skyline, and you can be in that space almost like a traditional veranda in a house in Kerala, and this becomes like a community veranda where people can come together, experience the rain, have a cup of tea, mingle, and enjoy with your neighbors. And these are some of the initializations. That's the space. Each of the units gets transferred, all the columns gets transferred except for for each of the units at the higher level. There's a transfer slab which takes all the services, but the ground just becomes this wonderful 1-acre park. And that's that space. I mean, the landscape is yet to come in, but just to give you a sense of that space, and it is envisioned to become that public space and a public park for community to kind of come together. All the parking is hidden below grade. This is another project, again in Trivandrum. It's in the heart of the city, very close to the other one, but it's right at that junction. And what was interesting about this project was that all around the neighborhood was these 3-story, 4-story neighborhood buildings which were all preserved. It's right opposite to the Raj Bhavan. And this is the first site where the height was allowed. And so how do you negotiate with that density when you have these two kinds of cities? On one level, we knew that if that particular object, that taller element will really anchors that junction, which is a Vellayampalam junction, and create a place and anchor it as an urban node. On the other hand was that street activities at a scale which is kind of the 1-story, 2-story, 3-story scale, where pedestrians are so comfortable and so used to it. And so at one hand, we wanted to preserve that scale, while at the other end, we knew that it creates a very strong visual anchor for the city, urbanistically speaking, and it will really help create a place out of that junction. And so we started analyzing, mapping the context. We realized that the context is all these 3-story buildings with a swath of green, and you continue to sort of map that contextual section. And what we did is we took that contextual section and kind of flipped it up to kind of create a section which allows to kind of create these 3-story, 4-story clusters. And after every 4 stories, you create a community space, almost kind of replicating that kind of a horizontal section of the city in a vertical fashion. And we also wanted to organize that density in a way that you continue that 2-story experience of your ground. So you see, we convince the client to kind of do a retail at the ground floor. You can make that building part of that streetscape so that it continues to activate that streetscape, while the rest of the density is pushed back, then it hovers around it, so that you kind of start to lighten that density and still continues to keep that human scale at the city, at the ground level, at the street level. And so that then becomes the organization of the building. Those are sort of programmatic organization of the activities. The ground floor commercial ties to the street and the street activities, while the community spaces continue to anchor. And so the section was carefully drafted in a way that you continue to activate that ground and make that building part of the streetscape, while at a larger city level, urbanistic level, it continues to kind of anchor that building. These are some of the initial ones. The building is complete now. So you can see that ground floor retail, it's a Starbucks now. It kind of ties to that streetscape and activates that streetscape, while these housing clusters continue to kind of get organized and the density gets organized behind it. And at a larger level, at an urbanistic level, it really anchors that intersection and creates an urban node for the city of Trivandrum. This is my final project. This is again a housing project which we just completed in Bangalore. Again, very urban site, but when you go to the site, you see these wonderful banyan trees and rain trees on the site. How do you negotiate density in a site like that? How do you kind of challenge? How do you organize? How do you put 2.5 FSI on a site like that? You start to imagine like this. You realize that you can't do like that because there is a huge lot of density to negotiate. So we started mapping the trees of the site, and we allowed the building to just carve around these tree clusters. And so it was not just the idea of preserving the trees, but how do you make those trees part of your day-to-day life, the going forward? so that people gets connected to those trees and create a sense of place and sense of identities for the residents who occupy that building, which is so crucial for the idea of organizing density. So each of the units were designed in a way that then it opens up to a tree cluster. And so there are 4 units in a floor, and each of them kind of organized in a way that it opens up into the tree clusters, different tree clusters, and the building carves around that. And we also convince the client to do 2 building cores as opposed to 1 core, so that you can avoid the corridor, which allows these units to be completely cross-ventilated, almost float in this thing. So that's the organization of the building. Each of the units then start to connect to the tree clusters. And that then becomes, of course, ideas of sections, sectionally organizing to kind of connect that. Every unit, bedroom, living, dining, etc., opens up into the tree cluster. So from a larger building idea level to each of those unit idea level, to allow cross ventilation for each of the homes that kind of occupies. The ground becomes a place to experience these trees. It becomes a double height volume. That's the banyan court, to which sort of the reading lounge and this thing. So the ground becomes a wonderful place to experience these tree clusters. And the roof again is activated as a community space, becomes amphitheater, swimming pool, all kind of other activities. And the building is extremely transparent in the sense that it is completely cross-ventilated, allow the building to just, each of the units to open up in 2 directions and then capture the essence of the trees and make it part of that experience. And connect people with those and thereby create an identity. These are some of the initial renderings of how we kind of imagine. The building is complete now, extremely challenging, as you may understand, to kind of deal with all those trees. And the trees just start to do wonderful things which we never imagined. When you go to the 7th floor balcony, you will see trees, the foliage coming into your balcony, and it just allows that trees to kind of really become part of your day-to-day life. And you start to experience the city in a completely different way, because these louvers allows you to be in that space and completely have a space which constantly changes throughout the day because of the way you can kind of manage the light or control the light, shadows, etc., that kind of comes into those buildings. And so it becomes a very personalized space. You kind of engage with it in a very personal way, and that space becomes extremely intimate. When you choose to make it intimate, it becomes extremely open and connect with the tree when you choose to want to kind of have that. So the idea of modulating that space and allowing it to kind of connect to those tree clusters becomes extremely challenging and important in creating a sense of identity. We no longer live in a world of unlimited land resources. Buildings without a relationship to the land cannot continue to be the norm. Cities are increasingly becoming a collection of objects with little concern for their relationship to each other or for the larger idea of the city. Spaces left between them have become undesirable and inhabitable. Cities need squares, parks, walkways, spaces for children, places integral to community life that encourage human interaction and the sharing of pleasant experiences. We must develop a sensitivity to public space in urban and suburban environments, where the space between is becoming more important as densities increase. There has to be an organic relationship between buildings, people, sidewalks, open space, and park, not just isolated buildings rising up. The challenges that we face today, we will need high density, but we also need an intense use of the land. We believe that contemporary practices should urge to develop social values in our urban environments. We need to be concerned with the collective production of urban reality, with the rhythms of work, home, leisure, and life activities in which a society decodes and reproduces its spatiality. Boundaries created within spaces are incompatible components to the wholeness of the cities. The cities of the future should not be just dense, it should encourage creation of a strong sense of place and urban identity by merging personal and social identities. And I'll end with this wonderful quote from Korea in his lecture in '83 in London. He says that we are only as big as the questions we address. And this, to my mind, is a central riveting fact of life for architects in the third world. Not the size or the value of the projects we are working on, but the nature of the questions they raise, and which we must confront, a chance to grow the abiding virtue of a place in the sun. Thank you.